John Carter had spent the better part of 2 decades working as a garbage collector in the peaceful, picturesque neighborhood of Maple Grove. It wasn't the kind of job that people typically talked about at dinner parties, but it had its own rhythm, its own purpose. Every day, John followed the same route, the same familiar streets, picking up trash from the tidy homes that lined them. The residents had come to appreciate his work, and in turn, he had come to appreciate their quiet, predictable lives. He knew the names of every family, the faces of every child. Their small, simple acts of kindness, a wave here, a quick thanks there, had become a part of his daily routine. For John, there was comfort in routine. It was the one thing that kept the world feeling steady, a foundation in a life that had often seemed unpredictable. He'd been doing this job for so long that it had become second nature to him. He didn't even need to think about it anymore. The rhythm of the truck, the scrape of the metal as it collected each bin, he knew it all like the back of his hand. But today was different. It started with a phone call from his partner, Dan. Dan had come down with a sudden illness, a nasty stomach bug that had left him in no condition to work. At first, John thought about calling in another team member to help him, but then the reality of the situation hit him. It was his shift, and he'd have to do it alone. John had driven this route many times before, but doing it alone was a different kind of challenge. Without Dan to help with the heavy lifting and the logistics, he found himself falling behind schedule almost immediately. He could feel the pressure mounting as he sped through the quiet streets of Maple Grove, trying to make up for the lost time. The houses seemed to pass by in a blur, one after the other, as he tried to stay focused on his task. But despite his best efforts, something felt off. It wasn't the delays or the extra workload that bothered him. No, it was something deeper. Maybe it was the way the sun had risen that morning, casting a soft golden light over the neighborhood. Or perhaps it was the fact that the streets, typically so lively with the bustle of families getting ready for the day, were eerily quiet. John couldn't quite put his finger on it, but there was a palpable tension in the air that seemed to hang over everything. It was when he reached the corner of Oak Street that he saw them, Emily and her daughter, Zoe. They were standing outside their house, ready to leave for the day. Emily, who John had known for years, gave him a curt wave and a forced smile. "Morning," she said, but there was something in her tone that made him pause. It wasn't the usual friendly greeting that he had come to expect from her. No, this was different. This was distant, detached. And then there was Zoe. Zoe had always been one of those kids who would wave excitedly at John every morning, always ready to chat, always full of energy. But today, she didn't even look up as she passed him. She hurried past, her eyes fixed firmly on the ground, avoiding his gaze entirely. John felt a knot form in his stomach. Something wasn't right here. He had seen this family many times before. Emily was a single mother, and Zoe was her bright, cheerful daughter. But today, they both seemed distant. There was a tension between them, a coldness in the air that John couldn't explain. John tried to shake off the feeling, focusing on the work ahead of him. But as he continued down the street, his mind kept drifting back to Emily and Zoe. What was going on? Why had Zoe acted so strangely? Why had Emily seemed so distant? John couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. It wasn't just the odd greeting or Zoe's refusal to make eye contact. No, there was something more. Something deeper that he couldn't quite grasp. He pushed the thoughts to the back of his mind as he drove the truck further down Oak Street, but they lingered, like a shadow that wouldn't go away. Maybe it was nothing. Maybe he was reading too much into it. But John had learned to trust his instincts over the years, and right now, his instincts were telling him that something wasn't right. The rest of the morning passed in a blur of clattering bins and heavy lifting, but John couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't quite right. The thought of Emily and Zoe lingered in the back of his mind like an unresolved puzzle, its pieces scattered just out of reach. He couldn't stop thinking about that moment when Zoe had walked past him without so much as a glance. And Emily's strained mourning kept replaying in his head, echoing with an unfamiliar note of distress. By the time he arrived at Emily's house to pick up the trash, the unease in his stomach had only grown. He knew he should just do his job and move on, but he couldn't help himself. He had to know what was going on. As he approached the curb, John noticed something strange. The trash bin was unusually full, almost overflowing. He had collected Emily's trash enough times to know that she was a fairly tidy person, always making sure her bins were neatly packed and tied. But today, something seemed off. John made his way to the bin, eyeing the pile of garbage as he lifted the lid. The moment he peered inside, his heart skipped a beat. There, at the top of the pile, was a bag that didn't belong in the trash. It wasn't a bag of old food containers or empty bottles. No, this was something different. As John pulled the bag out of the bin, he could see the unmistakable outline of brand new clothes, still with the price tags attached. There were shirts, pants, shoes, all in perfect condition. But what really caught his attention was a neatly packed backpack that sat at the bottom of the bag. The zipper was closed tight, as if someone had carefully packed it. John felt his breath catch in his throat. This wasn't the kind of thing you'd throw away. These were brand new items, clothes that looked like they had never been worn, and school supplies that had never been touched. It was obvious that someone had gone to great lengths to purchase these things, only to discard them without a second thought. Why would Emily throw away perfectly good clothes and school supplies? It didn't make sense. The clothes were too new, the backpack too neatly packed to be trash. John felt a sudden knot in his stomach, a gnawing suspicion creeping in. Was it possible that something was wrong in that house? Could Emily really be throwing away things like this without reason? He took a deep breath, his mind racing with questions. He couldn't just ignore what he had found. It didn't feel right. And as he stood there, staring at the discarded items, he realized that he couldn't walk away. Not this time. John glanced toward the front door of Emily's house. He had to know what was going on. He had to understand why she was throwing away things that no one in their right mind would discard. And so, with a heavy heart and a sense of urgency, John made the decision to do something he rarely did. He was going to knock on her door. John hesitated as he walked up to the front door of Emily's house. The cool morning air seemed to press in around him, adding to the weight in his chest. He had always maintained a professional distance with the people he worked for. There were boundaries, after all. But today was different. Today, something inside him pushed him to go further than he had before. He stood at the door for a moment, unsure of what to say. His hand hovered over the knocker, then dropped. The question that had been gnawing at him, the question he needed answers to, was too important to ignore. He needed to know why Emily had thrown away perfectly good clothes, why Zoe had seemed so distant, why the air around their home felt so wrong. With a deep breath, John knocked. The seconds that followed felt like hours, and John's mind raced. The sound of footsteps inside, the faint shuffle of someone approaching the door, only heightened the tension in the air. Then, with a creak, the door opened slightly. Emily's face appeared in the gap, her tired eyes meeting his. She looked disheveled, as though she hadn't slept properly in days, and the edges of her features were drawn with visible anxiety. Her hair was slightly unkempt, her clothes worn in a way that seemed out of character for her usual neat appearance. "John?" Emily's voice was strained, and there was an odd edge to her words. She was trying to sound polite, but the effort was thin, barely masking the unease behind her eyes. "Hey, Emily," John began, his voice rougher than he'd intended. I noticed something while picking up the trash." He glanced down at the bag he'd placed beside the door, the one with the brand new clothes and the backpack. "I saw the clothes and the backpack in the trash. I just wanted to check in, see if everything's okay." For a moment, Emily's face tightened, and she looked away, as if searching for the right words. Her hands gripped the edge of the door, as if she was holding herself up. And then, before she could say anything, the loud crash of shattering glass rang out from inside the house, followed by the sound of something heavy hitting the floor. Emily froze. Her expression shifted rapidly, her face going pale, her eyes wide with fear. She glanced quickly over her shoulder, the door inching closer to closing. The fear that flickered in her eyes was enough to send a chill down John's spine. I have to go," Emily muttered, but before she could fully close the door, John stepped forward, his hand shooting out to stop it. "Emily, what's going on?" he asked urgently. "What was that noise? Is everything okay?" Her lips trembled, and for a brief moment it seemed as if she was going to tell him something. But then her expression hardened, and she shook her head. "Nothing for you to worry about, John. Just leave, okay?" She almost whispered the last words, her voice breaking. But John couldn't walk away now. He couldn't ignore what he had just heard. The shattering glass, the way Emily looked at him as though she was hiding something. Something wasn't right. He could feel it in his gut. Without thinking, he stepped forward again. "Emily, please, just let me help," he said, his voice growing more insistent. Before she could respond, the door slammed shut in his face. The sound echoed in the silence that followed, and John stood there, stunned. His heart raced as confusion and worry began to take root. Something was terribly wrong. But what could he do now? He stood frozen on the porch for a long moment, staring at the door, his mind whirling with questions he couldn't answer. He had come here hoping for answers, but instead, he felt like he had stepped into something much darker than he could have imagined. With a heavy sigh, John turned and walked back to the truck, the weight of the situation settling on his shoulders. He didn't know what was going on inside that house, but he couldn't shake the feeling that Emily and Zoe were hiding something, a secret that might be dangerous. John continued his route, but his thoughts were heavy. The entire morning had taken on an ominous tone. The strange events at Emily's house, her reaction, the noise, her refusal to talk, kept replaying in his mind. He tried to push it aside, telling himself he was overreacting, but deep down, he knew something wasn't right. He couldn't let it go. His mind drifted back to Zoe. The way she had avoided looking at him, the way she had hurried past him without so much as a glance. He couldn't help but wonder if she had seen something, heard something, or felt something that she wasn't telling anyone. Maybe she knew more than she let on. His thoughts were interrupted when he saw her. Zoe, running down the sidewalk towards him, her face a picture of distress. Her arms flailed as she moved quickly, her small feet barely keeping pace with the speed of her anxiety. John's heart lurched. Something was wrong. Zoe was usually a cheerful child, always quick with a smile or a wave, but today she was terrified. As she neared the garbage truck, Zoe stumbled to a stop, her face pale and tear-streaked. Her body was shaking, her hands trembling as she reached out, pointing toward her home. "Mr. Carter, please help me. He's hurting Mom." Zoe's voice cracked and she nearly collapsed as the words spilled out. Her breath came in ragged sobs. "Mom, he's hurting her again." John felt a surge of panic rise in his chest. He knew exactly who she was talking about, the man who had been in Emily's life for years. Dennis. He had seen the man a few times around the neighborhood, always gruff, always angry. He never seemed to show any affection for Emily or Zoe. John had always assumed it was just a rough patch in their lives, a bad relationship. But now, seeing Zoe's fear, hearing the urgency in her voice, John realized that it was much worse than he had imagined. Before he could speak, Zoe took a step back, her eyes wide with fear as she looked over her shoulder. "He's coming! Please, Mr. Carter, don't let him hurt me!" she cried, her voice trembling with desperation. John's protective instincts kicked in. He quickly stepped between Zoe and the direction she was looking, his body tensing in preparation for whatever was to come. A man appeared at the end of the driveway, a tall, angry figure. Dennis. He was glaring at Zoe, his fists clenched at his sides, his face twisted in a look of rage. His footsteps were heavy as he approached, his eyes never leaving Zoe. John didn't hesitate. He stepped in front of the young girl, his body tense, ready to protect her at all costs. The moment Dennis reached them, John spoke, his voice firm and steady. "Stay away from her," he ordered, standing his ground. Dennis froze, eyes narrowing in contempt. "What do you think you're doing, trash man?" He spat, his voice dripping with hostility. "This is none of your business. Get out of my way." John didn't move. He wasn't going to back down. "You're not touching her. Not today." Dennis sneered, a cold laugh escaping his lips. "You think you can stop me?" John's jaw tightened, but he stayed calm, keeping his eyes fixed on Dennis. He wasn't going to let this man lay a hand on Zoe. Not now. Not ever. And in that moment, as the tension hung thick in the air, John knew that his life was about to change forever. Dennis's glare intensified as John stood firmly in his way. The air seemed to grow heavier with every passing second, thick with unspoken threats. Zoe trembled behind him, her tiny frame barely visible as she hid against the side of the truck. John's mind raced. He wasn't a fighter by nature, but he would do whatever it took to keep this little girl safe. He knew he couldn't let this man hurt her. Not again. Dennis took a step closer, his body brimming with anger. "Move, you fool?" he snarled, his voice low and menacing. His eyes flickered over to Zoe, who was now shrinking further back, her face pale with fear. "You're going to regret this." John could feel his heartbeat pounding in his chest, but he kept his stance firm, his hands clenched into fists at his sides. His voice was steady, but there was an edge to it, one that betrayed the rising fury inside him. "I'm not going anywhere until you leave her alone. You don't have any right to hurt her or anyone else." Dennis's laugh was dark and hollow. "You really think you can stop me, huh? A garbage man like you? Stay out of my business if you know what's good for you." John's blood boiled. He had to fight to keep his composure, but everything in him screamed to act. The idea of this man, someone who should have been protecting Zoe, not terrorizing her, made his stomach churn. Zoe's small voice broke through the tension. "Mr. Carter, please, he's always like this," she whispered, her voice quivering with fear. "Mom is scared. He hurts her too. Zoe's words trailed off as she wiped her tear-streaked face, unable to continue. It was clear that she was too frightened to say anything more. John's heart clenched. This was more than just one man threatening a child. This was abuse that had been happening in the shadows, out of sight until now. John knew in that instant that he couldn't just walk away. He couldn't turn a blind eye any longer. With a steely resolve, John shifted his weight, preparing to step closer to Dennis. "You need to leave. Right now," John stated, his voice unwavering. Dennis's eyes darkened. "I told you to move, trash man," he growled, his hand shooting out to shove John aside. But John didn't budge. The force behind Dennis's shove was enough to throw a weaker man off balance, but John was prepared. With a quick step backward, he absorbed the push and stood his ground, refusing to let Dennis past him. Zoe, seeing the growing confrontation, began to back away further, her hands shaking at her sides. "Please, don't fight," she pleaded, her voice desperate. Dennis took another step forward, but John stepped in front of him again. "You've got one more chance to walk away, Dennis. Don't make me stop you." For a moment, the world seemed to hold its breath. Dennis's eyes flickered with anger, then something else, uncertainty perhaps. He was sizing John up, deciding whether or not this was a fight he wanted. But then, with a scoff, Dennis spat at John's feet and turned away. "You're lucky today," he muttered, "but don't think this is over." As Dennis stormed off, John remained where he stood, his heart still pounding. He kept his gaze fixed on the man's retreating figure until he disappeared down the street. Only then did he let out a shaky breath and turned around to face Zoe, who was standing behind him, watching with wide eyes. John knelt down in front of her, placing a hand on her shoulder. "Are you okay?" he asked gently, his voice softening. Zoe nodded slowly, wiping her eyes with the back of her hand. I'm scared," she whispered. "He's always like that. He hurts Mom, and when he's angry, he doesn't stop until he's gonna hurt her again." John's heart twisted at her words. He knew he couldn't let Zoe go back into that environment. He had to do something. He looked around, his mind racing for a solution. "Zoe, I promise you," John said softly but firmly, "I'm going to help you. You don't have to go back to that house, not if it means you'll be in danger." Her eyes searched his face for reassurance, and for the first time since he had met her, she allowed herself to smile faintly. "You promise?" she asked, her voice full of hope. "I promise," John replied without hesitation. With that, he stood and offered her his hand. "Come on," he said, his voice gentle. "Let's get you somewhere safe." Zoe's small hand slipped into his, and together they walked toward the safety of the truck. As they climbed inside, John's mind was set. He didn't know what would come next or how it would unfold, but he knew one thing. He wasn't letting Emily or Zoe face this alone. Whatever it took, he would protect them. The drive to the local coffee shop felt like it took forever. Zoe had fallen silent in the passenger seat, staring out the window, her small hands wringing together in her lap. John kept his focus on the road, but his mind kept circling back to the events that had just transpired. He had dealt with a lot in his line of work, but this was different. This was personal. He could feel the weight of his promise to Zoe pressing on him. There was no turning back now. He had made a vow to protect her, and he wouldn't fail her. When they finally arrived at the coffee shop, Zoe stepped out of the truck, her feet unsteady as she walked toward the entrance. She seemed lost in her own thoughts, her usual energy nowhere to be found. John followed her, his eyes scanning the surroundings. He wasn't sure what to do next. He had never been in a situation like this, and the uncertainty gnawed at him. He wanted to find Emily, but he wasn't sure where to start, and he needed to figure out how to get Dennis out of the picture for good. As they walked inside the coffee shop, the warm scent of fresh brews filled the air, and for a moment, Zoe seemed to relax, her shoulders dropping slightly. But John could still see the fear lingering in her eyes, the tension in her posture. "Zoe," he began, his voice quiet but filled with determination. "We need to figure out what's going on. You can't go back to that house, but we need your mom's help to make sure you're safe. Do you know where she is right now?" Zoe hesitated for a moment, her eyes downcast. "I don't know," she whispered. "She might be at home or maybe at the neighbor's. I don't know anymore. She's been hiding from him for so long." John's mind spun. He couldn't let Zoe go back to that place, and he couldn't allow Emily to stay there either. Not with Dennis still in the picture. "We need to find her," he said firmly. "And when we do, we'll get you both out of there for good." Zoe looked up at him, her eyes full of gratitude, yet shadowed with the burden of fear. "Thank you, Mr. Carter," she whispered, her voice small. "Thank you for helping us." John offered a reassuring smile, though it didn't quite reach his eyes. He was more determined than ever, but deep down, he knew that the road ahead would be difficult and dangerous. But he wasn't backing down. Not now, not ever. The air in the coffee shop seemed to have thickened as John and Zoe sat at a small corner table. The noise of the bustling shop, the clink of cups, the hum of conversation, felt distant to John, as if the world had faded into the background. His eyes remained focused on Zoe, who now appeared smaller than ever, her face marked by the silent toll of fear and uncertainty. He could feel the weight of the promise he'd made to her bearing down on him. It was a promise that, even though it had only just been spoken, felt unbreakable. Zoe needed safety. Emily needed safety. And no matter the cost, John would make sure they found it. Zoe had hardly spoken since they entered the shop, lost in her thoughts, but it was clear she was wrestling with a burden far beyond her years. John gently reached across the table and placed his hand over hers. She flinched for a moment, but then she relaxed slightly under the touch, her gaze lifting to meet his. "Zoe?" John began, his voice soft but firm. "Where exactly do you think your mom might be? Do you have any idea where Dennis might be right now?" Zoe hesitated. "She's probably at the neighbor's house, Mrs. Hart. She's always there when things get really bad. But she's scared. She won't leave him. She says she's protecting me, but I think she's just scared to be alone." John nodded, his heart sinking. He had no idea what kind of hold Dennis had on Emily, but it was clear it was something deeper than simple fear. It was manipulation, control, abuse. And Emily was trapped. "I'm not leaving here without her, Zoe," John said, the determination in his voice unmistakable. "You stay here. I'll go find her. If she's with Mrs. Hart, I'll get her to come with me. We'll all leave together. No one should have to live like this." Zoe's eyes filled with a mixture of hope and fear. "You promise?" "I promise," John said, his voice steady. "And I'm not going to let anything happen to you or your mom. You're both going to be okay." Zoe gave him a small, tentative smile, but it quickly faded, replaced by a look of worry. "I want to go home, but I can't. I just can't." Her voice cracked, and she quickly wiped her eyes with the back of her hand. John stood up from the table. "Stay here. I'll be back as soon as I can. I'm going to make sure she's safe. We'll all be safe." As John walked out of the coffee shop, his mind raced. He couldn't ignore the feeling that time was running out. Dennis would come looking for them. He was angry, desperate, and John didn't want to think about what he might do to them if he found out they were trying to escape. But he couldn't let that fear dictate his actions. He drove quickly to the neighborhood where Zoe had said Mrs. Hart lived. The houses there were small, but neat, with well-kept lawns and flowering gardens. It was a peaceful area, the kind of place where nothing out of the ordinary was supposed to happen. But John knew that appearances were deceiving. Beneath that quiet exterior, something dangerous was lurking. When he arrived at Mrs. Hart's house, he parked across the street and scanned the windows. There was no sign of movement, but he couldn't be sure. It had been over an hour since he'd left Zoe at the coffee shop, and every minute felt like an eternity. He hesitated for only a moment before walking up to the door and knocking. There was no answer at first, but then, after a moment of silence, he heard a soft voice call from inside. "Who is it?" It was Mrs. Hart. John took a deep breath and spoke in a low, reassuring tone. "Mrs. Hart, it's John Carter. I'm here for Emily and Zoe. I need to speak with them. Is everything okay?" There was a long pause, and then the door slowly creaked open. Mrs. Hart appeared in the doorway, her face pale and drawn. Her eyes flickered with recognition when she saw John, but there was also a sense of hesitation, like she wasn't sure whether to trust him. "Emily isn't here," she said quickly, glancing nervously over her shoulder. "She left just a few minutes ago. She's with Dennis." John's stomach tightened. "What do you mean? Where did she go?" I don't know. She's been staying here off and on, but she always goes back to him. I've tried to help her, but she won't leave him. She's scared." John felt the weight of her words crash down on him. Emily wasn't just running from Dennis. She was being controlled, trapped. And now, if she had gone back to him, it was possible she was in even greater danger than before. "Mrs. Hart," John said, his voice hardening with resolve, "I need you to help me. I'm going to get Emily out of there. She can't stay with him anymore. It's not safe." Mrs. Hart opened her mouth to protest, but John cut her off. "I know it's hard, but I can't do this without your help. I need to know where he might have gone." Mrs. Hart looked away for a moment, as if she was weighing her options. Then her gaze softened. "I think they're at the old cabin by the lake. He's been spending a lot of time there recently. I tried to warn her, but I'll find her." John interrupted, his voice determined. "I won't let him hurt her. Thank you, Mrs. Hart." Before she could say anything else, John turned and hurried back to his truck, his mind focused on only one thing: finding Emily, getting her out of that cabin, and making sure Zoe was safe. As he sped toward the lake, the sun was beginning to set, casting an orange glow over the landscape. But for John, it felt like the world had gone dark. Every instinct told him he was running out of time. The road to the lake was winding and narrow, cutting through dense trees that seemed to close in around him. The further he drove, the more isolated everything became. This was the kind of place where no one would hear you scream, where no one would come looking. John gripped the steering wheel tighter, the tension in his shoulders mounting with every passing second. His mind kept replaying the image of Zoe's tear-streaked face, her plea for help echoing in his ears. When he finally reached the cabin, the world around him seemed to hold its breath. The cabin stood like a dark, looming shadow in the distance, hidden behind thick trees. There were no signs of life, no movement. But John knew better than to think it was empty. He parked his truck a little ways off, keeping his headlights off to avoid drawing attention. Quietly, he made his way through the trees, his eyes scanning the area for any sign of Emily or Dennis. As he neared the cabin, he heard muffled voices coming from inside. The door was slightly ajar, and through the crack, John could just make out the silhouette of Emily. She was sitting at the table, her hands folded in front of her, and standing over her was Dennis. His presence was menacing, his shadow stretching across the room like a dark cloud. John's pulse quickened. He had to act fast. He couldn't risk Emily being hurt again. With a deep breath, he moved closer, inching toward the cabin. His every step was calculated, careful. He couldn't afford to make a sound, not now. Just as he reached the door, he heard Dennis's voice, low and threatening. "You think you can run from me? You think I won't find you? You belong to me, Emily. Don't forget that." The words hit John like a slap in the face. Emily wasn't just being abused, she was being controlled, and Dennis was making sure she never forgot it. John's hand gripped the doorknob. He wasn't going to let this man hurt her anymore. It was time to end this. John's heart was racing, the adrenaline coursing through his veins as he pushed the door open just enough to slip inside the cabin. The scent of old wood and mildew hung thick in the air, but it was the tension in the room that was suffocating. Emily sat motionless at the table, her face pale and drawn, her hands trembling in her lap. Dennis loomed over her, his voice a venomous hiss. "You think you're going to leave me, Emily? You think I'll just let you walk away?" Dennis's words were coated with malice, each syllable dripping with the weight of years of manipulation and control. John didn't waste another moment. His presence, like a sudden gust of wind, disrupted the momentary calm. Dennis turned quickly, his face twisting in surprise as he saw the tall figure standing at the threshold of the cabin. His eyes narrowed, calculating, ready for a fight. "Who the hell are you?" Dennis demanded, his voice low but brimming with threat. "I'm the man who's going to take her away from you," John said, his voice calm but laced with steel. He had no fear in him now, only determination. He could feel the weight of his words, and he knew they were true. Emily was going to be safe. This was no longer just about stopping Dennis. It was about giving Emily and Zoe the life they deserved, away from his cruelty. Dennis sneered, stepping closer to Emily, who flinched, pulling away instinctively. "You think you can just walk in here and tell me what to do?" "I don't think so." John stepped forward, his gaze hardening as he met Dennis's cold, threatening stare. "You've hurt her for the last time." Without warning, Dennis lunged toward him, a wild and angry force that John easily sidestepped. The years of intense training and discipline John had endured in the military had made him sharp, quick on his feet. He could feel the power of his own body in that moment, his muscles reacting before he could even think. "Get away from her," John growled, grabbing Dennis by the arm and twisting it behind his back. The sickening sound of bones grinding against each other echoed in the silence. Dennis grunted in pain but didn't have the strength to fight back. "Stop, please." Emily's voice, fragile and terrified, broke through the tension. John immediately loosened his grip, turning his attention back to her. "Emily, you're safe now. I promise you," John said, his voice gentle as he walked toward her. Her eyes were wide with shock, her body trembling from the ordeal. She hadn't believed it was possible to be free until now. Dennis was still struggling against John's hold, but it was clear he was no match for him. The fight had gone out of him when he realized he couldn't overpower this stranger who had entered his life like a whirlwind. John's presence was too much, his determination a force too strong for Dennis to challenge. "You can't do this, Dennis spat, his voice tinged with anger and humiliation. "She'll come back to me. You won't be able to protect her forever." John's eyes narrowed as he looked at Dennis. "She's not your possession. She's a human being, and she's free. She'll never go back to you." With one final push, John threw Dennis away from him, sending him crashing into the far wall of the cabin. Dennis hit the ground with a thud, momentarily dazed. The fight was over. John turned back to Emily, who was still sitting at the table, her hands clutched tightly together. "It's over. You're safe. We're getting out of here." Tears welled in Emily's eyes, but this time they weren't tears of fear. They were tears of relief. She stood up slowly, her body shaking, but the strength in her eyes had returned. She was no longer the victim, the one who had been helpless for so long. She was free. "Thank you," Emily whispered, her voice breaking as she took a tentative step toward John. John nodded, his expression softening. "Let's get you out of here." He extended his hand, and she took it, her grip surprisingly firm. Together, they walked out of the cabin, leaving Dennis behind, powerless and defeated. As they stepped into the cool night air, John could feel the weight lifting off his shoulders. It wasn't just Emily who was free now. It was Zoe, too. They were all free. The drive back to town was quiet, the night air thick with the sound of the engine humming steadily. But the tension between them had shifted. John kept his eyes on the road, his mind still focused on the aftermath of what had happened. He hadn't expected things to go so smoothly, but he knew it wasn't over yet. They still had a long road ahead of them, and Emily needed time to heal. Emily sat next to him, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. Her face was still pale, but there was a sense of peace in her eyes now. She wasn't the same woman who had been cowering under Dennis's control. She was strong, and John could see the fire inside her that had been smothered for so long. "How do you feel?" John asked softly, breaking the silence between them. Emily took a deep breath, her shoulders relaxing as she thought for a moment. "I feel relieved, but also scared. I don't know what's next. I've spent so long being afraid that I don't know how to live without him." John glanced at her briefly before returning his eyes to the road. "You don't have to figure it all out right now. Take it one step at a time. You're not alone in this anymore. You've got me, And you've got Zoe. She nodded, her voice steady but tinged with uncertainty. I want to believe that. I want to believe that I can rebuild. But it feels so overwhelming. John could understand that feeling. He'd been there himself, standing at the edge of something new, something terrifying, unsure of what the future would hold. But one thing was certain. They were no longer running. They were choosing their own path, and that made all the difference. We'll take it slow, John said reassuringly. There's no rush. But one thing's for sure, you've already taken the hardest step. You got away. You're free. Emily looked out the window for a moment, as if lost in thought, before finally turning to him. How do you stay so strong? She asked, her voice quiet but filled with curiosity. John smiled, though it was a bittersweet smile. You do it for the people who need you. You don't have a choice. You keep fighting because the ones you care about are counting on you. Emily took another deep breath and nodded. I think I'm ready to fight too. John's smile grew a little wider. Good, because this is just the beginning. As they drove through the night, the road ahead uncertain but full of possibilities, John knew that they had crossed a line they couldn't go back from. The world might still be full of challenges, but they had each other. And that was enough to start anew. The past would always be a part of them, but they had the power to shape their future. And for the first time in a long while, Emily believed that. Days passed quickly after that fateful night. John's life had shifted, his focus now completely on Emily and Zoe. The fear that had once clouded Emily's eyes had gradually transformed into something else. Hope. Hope for a future that no longer felt controlled by the fear of Dennis's grip. Hope for the chance to be free, to finally live her life on her own terms. The small town they had driven to was a fresh start, a clean slate. John had found a modest house on the outskirts, away from the prying eyes of anyone who might know their past. The place was simple, but it was peaceful, and for now, that was all they needed. Emily's tension had eased, but there were still moments of hesitation, moments when she wondered if it was really over, if she was truly free. And John was there to reassure her, to show her with every action that they had crossed the threshold into a new chapter. It wasn't an easy transition. Every day felt like a small battle, one where Emily had to remind herself that she was no longer at the mercy of someone else's cruelty. She had the power now. She could make decisions. She could breathe freely. Zoe was adjusting, too. The little girl had been quiet since they arrived, her innocence overshadowed by the heaviness of the trauma she had witnessed. But the moment she stepped into the house, a spark had lit in her eyes. The warmth, the calm. It was as though she had found her own safe haven. Slowly, her laughter returned, tentative at first, but it grew stronger with each passing day. Emily, too, was rediscovering herself. It wasn't easy, but she started taking small steps toward regaining control. She enrolled in a local art class, something she had always dreamed of, but had never been allowed to pursue. John encouraged her, reminding her that she was not only capable, but deserving of a life full of joy, not just survival. One evening, as they sat together in the cozy living room, the light from the fire casting soft shadows across their faces, Emily finally spoke the words she had been holding back. John, I don't know how to thank you for everything, for rescuing us, for giving us this new life. But more than that, thank you for showing me that I'm not broken, that I can still be whole. John looked at her, his heart swelling with emotion. It wasn't the thanks that mattered, it was the strength she was finding in herself. You've always been whole, Emily. You just needed someone to remind you of it. Her eyes shimmered with unshed tears as she reached out and took his hand. I know, and I think I'm starting to believe it. There were no grand speeches, no perfect solutions. But in that moment, in that quiet room filled with warmth and tenderness, they both understood that healing didn't come from grand gestures. It came from small acts of kindness, from support, from standing together and believing in each other. And for Emily, Zoe, and John, this was only the beginning. A future filled with possibilities, with love and with freedom. Months passed, and life in the small town continued to grow brighter for Emily, Zoe, and John. Emily had found a new rhythm to her life. Her art had flourished, and with John's encouragement, she had even begun to sell some of her pieces. The small community embraced her, and she started to make connections, friendships she had never been allowed to have before. John, too, had found peace in his new role. His protective nature had naturally extended to Emily and Zoe, and while he never sought praise for what he had done, he found fulfillment in the joy of watching Emily come into her own. Every day, he saw the layers of fear and doubt lift from her shoulders. It was slow, it was steady, but it was progress. One Saturday afternoon, as they were all sitting in the backyard, enjoying the warmth of the sun, Zoe ran up to them, her face beaming with excitement. "Mom, look what I drew!" she exclaimed, holding up a picture she had made with crayons. Emily took the drawing in her hands, her heart swelling with pride. "It's beautiful, Zoe," she said softly, tracing the lines with her finger. John watched them, a quiet smile tugging at his lips. This moment was everything. It wasn't just about rescuing Emily from her past. It was about helping her and Zoe build a future where they could thrive. A future full of love, of laughter, and of possibilities they had never imagined before. "You know, Emily," John said after a while, "I've been thinking, maybe it's time to make this permanent. I mean, the house, the life, all of it. If you're ready, we can make a home here, together." Emily looked up at him, a mix of surprise and emotion in her eyes. She had never thought of herself as someone who could truly have a home, a real home. But now, standing in front of John, the man who had helped her reclaim her life, it felt like a dream she could believe in. I think I'm ready," she said, her voice trembling slightly with the weight of her words. John reached out, pulling her close, his heart full. "Then let's do it. This is our chance, Emily. And I'm not going anywhere." As they stood there holding each other, the world seemed to stretch out before them, wide open, full of hope and promise. There were still challenges ahead, no doubt. But for the first time in a long time, Emily felt ready to face them, to walk beside John and Zoe, and to finally live the life she had always deserved. Together, they had found the courage to move forward. And no matter what came next, they knew they had each other. And that, in itself, was enough. Looking back on the difficult months that had passed, Emily couldn't believe how much her life had changed. From a woman silently enduring brutality, she had found a safe haven, where every day became a new opportunity to start over. Together with John and Zoe, she had not only rebuilt her life, but also discovered strengths she never dreamed she possessed. She was no longer just a mother. She was a confident, strong woman, full of dreams and hope for the future. John, the man she once thought of as a stranger, had become her steadfast companion, her solid support, showing her a world filled with love and possibilities. He had not only rescued them from the grip of violence, but he had also helped them realize that with love and perseverance, anything could change. For Zoe, the little girl who once lived in fear, there were no more shadows, just bright smiles and dreams of a future where darkness would no longer hold sway. Together, they were a family, the one Emily had always hoped for. And while the road ahead was long, they would face every challenge hand in hand. Their journey was far from over. There would be hard days, but Emily knew she was no longer alone. She had found herself again, and along with it, love and security. Above all, she had taught herself and Zoe that no matter what life throws at you, with love and resilience, anything is possible. In the end, this wasn't just the story of a woman who had found her life again. It was the story of healed souls, of hearts that had learned to love and rise from the wounds of the past. Thank you so much for taking the time to listen to this story. We hope it touched your heart and left you with a sense of hope and inspiration. Your support means the world to us. If you enjoyed this story, please give us a thumbs up, share it with your friends, and don't forget to subscribe to our channel for more amazing content. Your likes and comments help us create more stories that matter and inspire others. Stay tuned for more, and we look forward to sharing more heartfelt stories with you in the future. Thank you again for being part of this journey. Until next time, take care and keep spreading kindness.